15th April, 1984, Her Majesty's Theatre, London. The show was called Live from Her Majesty's. 12 million people were watching. At 8:27 p.m., Tommy Cooper walked onto the stage wearing his trademark red fez. The audience erupted. They always did. For 30 years, Tommy Cooper had made Britain laugh. The bumbling magician who got every trick wrong. The comedian who was funny just standing there. Tonight would be his final performance. But nobody knew that yet. Tommy sat in his dressing room at 6:45 p.m., staring at his reflection. The makeup was done. The fez was ready. The props were lined up. In 45 minutes, he'd walk onto that stage and do what he'd done 1,000 times before. Make them laugh. At 62, he was tired. His assistant Mary had noticed it. The way he sat down between rehearsals. The way he breathed heavier, climbing stairs. The slight tremor in his hands when he thought nobody was watching. "You all right, Tom?" she'd asked that afternoon. "Fine, love. Just fine." He wasn't fine. He'd had chest pains for weeks, sharp ones, the kind that made you stop and catch your breath. But the show was booked. 12 million people would be watching. "You didn't cancel for chest pains." A knock on the door. "5 minutes, Mr. Cooper." Tommy stood, adjusted his fez, looked in the mirror one last time. The face staring back was tired, but it would do. In Manchester, 47-year-old Patricia Wilson settled onto her sofa with a cup of tea. Sunday night. Live from Her Majesty's on ITV. Her husband Derek was already in his chair, newspaper on his lap. "Tommy Cooper's on tonight," Patricia said. Derek grunted approval. Everyone loved Tommy Cooper. Even Derek, who rarely found anything funny, would chuckle at Tommy's stumbling magic tricks. Their daughter Emma, 16, sat on the floor, homework forgotten. Sunday night variety shows were old-fashioned, her friend said. But Tommy Cooper was different. Tommy Cooper was funny. In Liverpool, 58-year-old Frank Mitchell poured himself a whiskey. His wife had gone to bed early. The house was quiet, just him and the television. Live from Her Majesty's was starting. Frank had seen Tommy Cooper live once, in 1967. Blackpool, front row. He'd laughed so hard his ribs hurt for 3 days. Tonight would be almost as good. Television couldn't quite capture Tommy's physical presence, but it was close enough. In Edinburgh, 71-year-old Margaret Ross sat alone in her flat, her cat on her lap, the television glowing. She'd been watching Tommy Cooper since the 1950s, had all his records, knew all his catchphrases. Just like that, she smiled, anticipating the show. The lights came up at 8:15 p.m. The orchestra played. The host introduced the acts, singers, dancers, comedians, all leading up to the main attraction, Tommy Cooper. In living rooms across Britain, people leaned forward slightly. Tommy was on soon. Backstage, Tommy waited in the wings. Mary stood beside him, straightening his bow tie unnecessarily. "You sure you're all right?" she asked again. "Stop fussing," Tommy said, but he smiled. Mary had been his assistant for 12 years. She worried. The act before him finished. Applause. The host's voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Tommy Cooper." The audience erupted. Tommy walked on stage. The applause was deafening. Tommy stood center stage, fez slightly crooked, holding a cloak and a wand. The setup for his magic act. The act everyone knew would go hilariously wrong. Patricia Wilson in Manchester leaned back on her sofa, already smiling. This was going to be good. Frank Mitchell in Liverpool took a sip of whiskey, settling in. Margaret Ross in Edinburgh scratched her cat's ears, waiting for Tommy to speak. Tommy raised the cloak, started his routine. The audience laughed. They always laughed. Even before the joke, they laughed. That was Tommy's gift. He was funny existing. Then 15 seconds into the act, Tommy stumbled. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just a small stumble, like he'd missed a step. The audience laughed. Tommy tried to recover, lifted the cloak again. But his movements were wrong. Too slow. Too heavy. The audience laughed harder. Tommy fell. He didn't collapse dramatically. He didn't clutch his chest and cry out. He just sat down. Hard. Suddenly, his legs folding under him, the cloak falling, the wand rolling across the stage, and the audience roared. This was classic Tommy, the clumsy magician who couldn't even stand properly. Brilliant physical comedy. They'd seen him do similar falls before. The way he'd sit there, looking confused, waiting for the laugh to build. In Manchester, Patricia Wilson laughed. "Look at him," she said to Derek. "He's brilliant." Derek chuckled, shaking his head. "That Tommy." In Liverpool, Frank Mitchell laughed so hard he had to set down his whiskey. The man was a genius. The way he just sat down like that. Perfect timing. In Edinburgh, Margaret Ross smiled. She'd seen this bit before. In 1972. Blackpool again. Tommy would sit there for 30 seconds, maybe more, just looking bewildered. Then he'd stand up and continue like nothing had happened. On stage, Tommy wasn't moving. The audience kept laughing. Behind the curtain, Mary felt something wrong. The way Tommy had fallen. The way he was sitting. That wasn't a bit. "Tommy," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her. The audience laughed louder. 30 seconds passed. Tommy still hadn't moved. Still sat there, collapsed against the curtain backdrop. The cloak twisted around his legs. The laughter began to thin. Not stop, just thin, like air leaking from a tire. In Manchester, Patricia frowned. How long is he going to sit there? Derek didn't answer. He was watching closely now. Something about Tommy's position, the way his head was tilted. That didn't look comfortable. In Liverpool, Frank's smile faded. Tommy's face. Even from this distance, through the television camera, something looked wrong. Too pale. Too still. In Edinburgh, Margaret leaned forward, disturbing her cat. "Tommy?" On television, the camera was still on him. Still filming. 12 million people watching. The director in the control room uncertain. Was this part of the act? Should he cut away? But it was Tommy Cooper, the man who made falling funny. The audience laughed nervously now. Uncertain. Mary pushed past the stage manager, ran onto the stage, knelt beside Tommy. "Tommy," she touched his shoulder. His head lolled. She saw his face up close. "Oh, God. Get a doctor," she screamed. "Someone get a doctor." The laughter stopped. In 12 million living rooms across Britain, people sat forward, confused. This wasn't comedy anymore. The camera cut away. Suddenly, abruptly, went to a wide shot, then to the host looking off stage, his face showing something between confusion and horror. "We're having technical difficulties," the host said, his voice shaking slightly. "We'll be right back." Commercial break. In Manchester, Patricia set down her tea. "What just happened?" "I don't know," Derek said. He stood up, walking closer to the television. "That didn't look right." Emma was silent, staring at the screen now showing an advert for washing powder. In Liverpool, Frank stood too. That wasn't part of the act. The way that woman had run on stage, the way she'd screamed, that was real panic. In Edinburgh, Margaret's hand covered her mouth. Her cat jumped off her lap, startled by her sudden tension. "No," she whispered. "No, please." Tommy was in an ambulance, sirens wailing, paramedics working on him, chest compressions, oxygen mask, everything they could do in a moving vehicle racing through London streets. Mary sat beside him, holding his hand, or trying to. The paramedics kept pushing her back, needing space to work. "Is he going to be all right?" she asked. Nobody answered. At Westminster Hospital, emergency staff waited. They'd been called 3 minutes ago. Cardiac arrest, incoming. ETA, 5 minutes. The show came back from commercial at 8:40 p.m. The host stood center stage, where Tommy had fallen just minutes ago. His face was pale. The autocue forgotten. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice shaking, "I'm afraid there's been an incident. Tommy Cooper has been taken ill and has been rushed to hospital. We're going to continue with the show, and we'll bring you updates as we have them." The orchestra played. Another act came on. Singers. They sang their song, but nobody was really listening. Not the audience in the theater. Not the 12 million watching at home. In Manchester, Patricia grabbed Derek's hand. "He's going to be all right, isn't he?" Derek didn't answer. He'd seen that fall, the way Tommy had collapsed. That wasn't a stumble. That was something serious. In Liverpool, Frank poured another whiskey, didn't drink it, just held the glass. Stared at the television where singers were pretending everything was normal. In Edinburgh, Margaret started crying. She didn't know why yet, didn't know anything for certain, but she knew. The way you know things sometimes, that something terrible had happened. At Westminster Hospital, doctors worked on Tommy for 43 minutes. CPR, defibrillator, adrenaline, everything in the emergency medicine playbook. Mary waited outside, pacing. Other performers from the show had arrived, standing in the corridor, silent, waiting. At 9:15 p.m., a doctor emerged, looked at Mary, shook his head. "I'm sorry, we did everything we could." Mary sat down. Didn't cry, not yet, just sat. The other performers stood there not knowing what to do. What do you do when someone dies doing what they loved? When someone dies making people laugh? The show ended early, cut short. The host came back on camera at 9:20 p.m., a piece of paper in his shaking hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have very sad news. Tommy Cooper died this evening at Westminster Hospital. He was 63 years old." Silence. Then the national anthem, the screen going dark. In Manchester, Patricia made a sound. Not a scream, not a cry, just a sound. Derek turned off the television. They sat in silence. Emma got up, went to her room without a word. In Liverpool, Frank set down his whiskey glass, stood, walked to the window, looked out at the dark street. Behind him, the television was off, the house silent. In Edinburgh, Margaret covered her face with her hands and sobbed. Her cat came back, concerned, rubbing against her leg. She picked it up, held it close. "He made us laugh," she said to the empty room. "For 30 years he made us laugh." The news spread quickly. Phone calls, neighbors knocking on doors. "Did you hear?" By 10 p.m., Britain knew. The comedian who made dying look funny had died trying to make them laugh. The papers would call it tragic. They'd say he died doing what he loved. They'd say he went out the way he'd have wanted. But that night in 12 million homes across Britain, people just felt sad and guilty. They'd laughed while he died. They hadn't known. How could they have known? It was Tommy Cooper. Tommy Cooper was always funny. Even dying, he'd made them laugh. The funeral was held 5 days later. Thousands lined the streets. Comedians, magicians, ordinary people who'd loved watching him on television. The coffin passed slowly, draped in the Union Jack. On top, his red fez. Inside the church, Mary sat in the front row. She hadn't cried yet. Not properly. She kept expecting Tommy to walk through the door, to say it was all a joke. His biggest trick yet, making everyone think he'd died. But he didn't walk through the door, because it wasn't a joke. Tommy was gone. The vicar spoke about Tommy's career, his charity work, his love for his family, his gift for making people happy. But what the vicar didn't say, what nobody said, was the strange, cruel poetry of how he died. A comedian dying on stage, making people laugh until the very last second. There's something almost perfect about it, something Tommy himself might have appreciated if he'd been there to see it. But he wasn't there. He was in the coffin, under the fez. Years later, people still talked about that night. April 15, 1984. The night Tommy Cooper died live on television. They'd argue about whether it was tragic or fitting, whether he'd have wanted it that way, whether they should feel guilty for laughing. But mostly when they talked about it, they remembered the laughter, the way Tommy had made them feel, the way he'd made everyone feel for 30 years. Like anything could be funny if you looked at it right. Like falling down was just another kind of dance. Like dying was just another bit, if you had the timing right. Patricia Wilson in Manchester never watched variety shows again. Couldn't. Every time she tried, she'd remember Tommy sitting there on the stage, the way she'd laughed. The guilt never quite went away. Frank Mitchell in Liverpool kept watching, kept laughing at comedy, but he never forgot that moment. That split second when laughter turned to horror, when comedy became tragedy, when the line between the two disappeared completely. Margaret Ross in Edinburgh lived until 1995. When she died, her family found all of Tommy's records carefully stored. A letter with them said, "Please don't throw these away. They're important. They're proof that once, someone made the whole country laugh." Tommy Cooper died doing magic tricks on live television. 12 million people watched. Most of them laughed. Some of them cried. All of them remembered, because some moments don't fade. Some moments define not just a person, but an entire relationship between performer and audience. The contract that says, I will make you laugh and you will love me for it. Even when the joke is on me, even when the last trick is death itself, even then, especially then, we laugh. Because that's what Tommy taught us. That's what Tommy gave us. The permission to laugh at everything, to find the comedy and tragedy, to see the fez still spinning long after the magician has left the stage. 15th April 1984. The night Tommy Cooper made Britain laugh one last time. The night he died the way he lived. Funny, even when it wasn't.